I'd like to introduce Michael Taft, who's an economist with the trade union Unite, but whose role goes beyond that. He challenges the government's analysis of the crisis on the mass media with community groups. And even when I was organizing Occupy University during the Occupy movement, he answered the call to give economics lectures on the streets as well. So, Michael Taft.
Thank you, Helena, and thank you for inviting me here. I actually just want to put forward a very simple thesis and try to develop this, and that is that the Troika intervention in Ireland did not represent a new agenda or an externally imposed agenda on the Irish economy, but rather it underwrote a set of policies that were already being pursued by our own domestic elite and were already embedded in the economy by the time they came. In other words, there was a mutual agenda with very little conflict between what became the official lender and the official borrower in the bailout program. There we go.
Sorry about that.
No, I don't have that much in the way of graphs anyway. Why did Troika have to come in? Simply because the international markets would not fund the very policies that the Troika actually endorsed. They would not fund a highly deflationary fiscal program during a period when output was in substantial decline, while at the same time there was a massive credit constraint, and all the while the state was absorbing an enormous amount of bank debt on the public books. No self-respecting international market would fund such a program. So in that respect, when it came to Ireland, the Troika represented austerity's lender of last resort. And the government was doing already what the Troika would have told it to do long before the Troika was even conceived of. Just make a couple points in this regard. The Troika, actually, its official presence came in early 2011. The Memorandum of Understanding was signed in December 2010. It was 2011. But by that time, the government had already implemented austerity measures, the equivalent of 10% of GDP. Actually, more than half of the fiscal consolidation measures that have been introduced to date were introduced prior to the Troika's intervention. It started in 2008. In 2009, we had 3 separate budgets, and it continued on in 2010 and 2011. And indeed, the outline of measures to be implemented up to 2014 were already agreed well before the Troika intervention. Now, in terms of the banking policies, here's where the narrative gets a little bit muddy, because there's a considerable number of interests in Ireland that would like to project the banking crisis on Ireland as something imposed by outsiders, usually the Germans. Sometimes the French. I never understand why the French get thrown in there, but I guess it's because they're on the continent and they're big. We have the Bundesbank and the Bundestag, and we don't have the British anymore. They're, therefore another kind of historical complaint. And then we are somehow portrayed as a victim of these externally imposed policies. This is absolutely not the case. The banking crisis was imposed on Ireland by our own domestic elite, allied to our own financial capitalist class in order to save and bail out our own financial capitalist class. The bank guarantee in 2008, the nationalization of Anglo-Irish in early 2009, NAMA, the recapitalization of Irish banks, all took place before or were in the process of being implemented well before the Troika came into being. The fact is that our policies towards finance capital and our own financial sector was consistent with past practice, going all the way back to the foundation of the state. Namely, that finance capital in the financial sector is given a privileged position in the Irish economy. It was not a break with past policy, and it was not in any way a result of outside pressure. Now, that's not to say it wasn't there weren't problematic tensions in that. For instance, the ECB did, well, we're pretty sure anyway, that they did lobby hard to push, behind the scenes, to push Ireland into the bailout program. But if that did occur, and it probably did, it wouldn't have meant much because we were heading into a bailout program pretty quickly anyway. And so they probably only just fast forwarded a few weeks or a few months. Secondly, it is the case that, or at least we are told, this is where we don't get any kind of official documents, letters are not published, memoranda are not leaked in this regard, but it's quite possible that when the new government came in 2011, they did want to burden share with some of the senior bondholders, and they were resisted by the ECB on pain of withdrawal of support to our banking system. But the problem is that by then most of the damage had been done. Most of the creditors had been redeemed. Most of the bondholders had been bailed out. So if the ECB told Ireland to go lie in its bed, it's a bed that we made for ourselves and which we had been staying in for a long time. So ultimately, the Troika intervention was necessary because markets would not fund the very policies that first got us into the bailout and were supported in the bailout thing. It's not that the policies themselves challenged any type of macroeconomic orthodoxy. And I'll just give a couple examples here of why we got booted out and why the international markets didn't take us seriously. Here's the austerity adjustments, mostly spending cuts that were imposed in 2010, 2011, 2012. 2011 would have happened prior, that would have been implemented prior to the Troika intervention. But as you can see, there's about 15 billion euros in austerity measures, what we might call fiscal effort. And yet, look at the savings. This comes from the model developed by the Nevin Economic Research Institute. The savings were very small. In other words, it was an extremely wasteful and inefficient way to address the issue of fiscal consolidation, of trying to resolve the budget deficit. And at each turn, and the reason why this occurred, and I'll just go through quickly on this, the reason why this occurred is because, again, this is Neary's model. We find that the deficit reduction as a percentage of the spending cut was very low. In fact, here's where the absurdity of austerity comes to the fore. Cutting public sector employment actually increased the deficit and increased the debt. And in terms of the increase in debt, this is confirmed by the ESRI, the Economic Social Research Institute, which actually is a fan of austerity and supports austerity. But they even admit that in some instances the austerity has actually had a perverse effect. So in total, there was no way, if the international markets were concerned, and if international observers and commentators were concerned about reducing the deficit, there was no way that this massive program of austerity was going to do it, because in some cases it actually achieved the opposite. And again, another reason why the international markets withdrew support from us is, you can see, look at the bank debt as a percentage of GDP. Direct debt, that's that which is actually a credit to our public finances. In Ireland's case, a quarter of our GDP in bank debt, compared to the Eurozone, 1%. Contingent liability, that's contingent debt. If something goes wrong, then we have to pay up. This comes through the bank guarantee. Nearly 70% of our GDP on contingent liability, as opposed to 5% in the Eurozone. If you look at total debt, nearly 100% made up of direct and contingent debt. Now I ask you, what lender would lend that money to anybody, a household or a business or anything like that, that not only has such a high direct debt, but an unknown contingent debt? So that we can see is the reasons why they withdrew that and why the Troika stepped in. But it wasn't. They didn't step in because there was dispute over policies, as I said, because there was a seamless kind of entry of the Troika when it came to the issue of how policy would be conducted. I just want to look at three areas of social consequences. I just want, because I could focus on a number of things. But this is one thing here that rarely gets much attention in the national agenda, probably because it would be so embarrassing. You certainly couldn't be trying to drive a tax cut agenda, which the government is currently trying to do, when you have statistics like this. But as you can see, we have the CSO, our Central Statistics Office, has a measurement of national deprivation. They take a number of deprivation experiences, and if you experience two or more of those deprivation experiences, things like unable to afford to heat your home, unable to meet a bill, unable to have a substantial meal every second day, unable to afford waterproof shoes, unable to afford new clothes. If you hit two of those, you are defined as officially in the deprivation rate. 2011, unfortunately, is the last year we have to do. Look at the adults, 24%. 1 out of every 4 Irish person you meet suffers multiple deprivation experience. If you're going out in Dublin today, later today, this evening, just know that, on average, 1 in 4 person you see on the street suffers multiple deprivation experience. And that has been nearly doubled in just a 3-year period of this period of austerity. By the way, a period of austerity where it wasn't the Troika, it was our own domestic elite. With children, it's even worse. Nearly a third, 1 in 3 children live in households that suffer multiple deprivation experience. But it's not just about, people say, oh, well, that's just about, social welfare recipients, and somehow they're a different class. But anyway, it's kind of dismissed as that, and that doesn't belong to the alarm clock generation, those who get up out of bed and go to work. Well, unfortunately, in-work deprivation is not a whole lot better. One-income households, a household with one income for work, 27% suffer multiple deprivation. And this is really interesting. Household with 2 incomes. You'd think a household with 2 people working, 2 partners working, would probably be doing okay. Oh, maybe not the best, but okay. 1 out of every 10 suffer multiple deprivation experience. How much time do I have, Helena?
5 minutes.
5 minutes.
10.
10. Okay. Listen, I won't go through this. This is the Eurostat severe material deprivation. This is even worse. This is 9 indicators and you hit 4. And the only thing I'll say is just look at a couple of groups. Lone parents in Ireland, 1 out of every 4 lone parents suffer severe material deprivation, and more than 1 out of 4 of public housing tenants. And I'm not going to, some of our guests here will be interested to know that the Irish economy is generating 60,000 jobs a year due to the success of the government program, 60,000 jobs. To put that in perspective, that's the average amount of jobs that we were creating during the boom period, during the property-fueled boom period, when GDP and GNP were going off the roof, 60,000. Of course, it's a nonsense, a statistical fluke. But, it's very difficult to kind of get that into the debate because you've got to talk about differences in sampling size and all this. But here's just one thing which goes to show what is behind the fall in unemployment, because unemployment has been falling over the last 2 years. You can see that 75,000 fall in unemployment. Thing is, 116,000 working age recession-related immigrants during that same period. That's not the full amount of immigration. That's just working age, and that's just a proportion of those who have emigrated above the pre-2007 crash. 116,000 and 29,000 on labor activation measures. So all told, 145,000 immigrants or labor market activants, and only about 22,000 increase in jobs. So the fall in Irish unemployment is largely due to immigration, which is an age-old thing. And I'm not going to go into that because, we can get into the employment things there. But the third consequence is, as you can see, is investment. By 2018, the IMF projects that Ireland's going to be at the bottom of the Eurozone table, at the bottom, apart from Cyprus, yes. That is an indication of the extent to which austerity has hollowed out our productive capacity, and an indication of how it will not be the productive economy in the future that will drive economic growth. It will be, as the last central bank quarterly suggested, its quarterly report, the central bank said, the Irish economy is going to grow by 2.5% this year or next year or whatever, 2.5%. But unfortunately, a substantial amount of that will come through our Irish Financial Services Centre, finance capital, which will have very little impact on the domestic economy. And so we will see a lot of phantom growth through tax haven activities and through the IFSC. I won't go through the political impact because I just want to get on to some of the things that actually the bailout was successful on. I just say this. The Troika did provide crucial political support for the government in this respect. The government changed in 2011. A lot of people didn't actually really read the manifestos of the two parties that got elected very clearly because they were intent on actually conducting an essential democratic coup d'etat, kicking out Fianna Fáil. The destruction of Fianna Fáil was a watershed up to that point. It was quite a seismic event. And if there was a sense that the government could change policy instruments and didn't, that could create quite a strong political reaction. But of course, there was the Troika there, fortunately, and the timing was fortuitous. So that the Troika was there to be able to reinforce that there is no alternative line. And so therefore, the government could do this kind of choreography with the Troika. Well, maybe we'd like to do something different, but there's the Troika. The fact is, they never really wanted to do something different. And to give you one example, we're told the Troika required us to privatize the state assets? No. How do I know this? Because I read the Memorandum of Understanding. There's no reference to privatizing state assets. There's a reference to having a study with an impact on competition within the sector, but nothing to do with fiscal consolidation, nothing to do with privatization. That was a policy that was brought in by Fine Gael. That was, again, a government-driven policy, even within the context of the austerity program. And I will briefly, just very quickly here. So what was the Troika, quote, the government Troika program successful in doing? Well, profits. Ireland is a very generous place for profits, as you can see, historically always much higher than the EU as a percentage of GDP. And I'll just get to one little caveat in a minute. But as you can see, profits took a real hit, when the recession came, the collapse in financial and property speculation activities. But thankfully that's been rehabilitated. That's one of the few successes of getting something back up on its feet and growing again. That's exactly what they did for profits. And to give you an idea, profit per employee in the EU, approximately 15,000 per employee. In Ireland, 51,000 per employee. Why is it so high? Because, of course, a lot of profits, and this is by just the official statistic, a lot of profits generated in other economies, lo and behold, end up here to take advantage of our tax system. We're not supposed to call it a tax haven, we're supposed to call it an efficient corporate tax structure. But it's really a tax haven. This doesn't actually include the kind of money that recently Professor Jim Stewart from TCD identified as the billions of American multinational US dollars coming through Ireland through tax avoidance mechanisms, stateless companies, etc. So we have not only maintained, but we are starting to regrow Ireland as a place where it's a safe haven for corporate profits. And at least you think that if we're going to be a tax haven, at least could we get some investment out of it. But I just threw up that little graph to show that we don't even get more investment per employee than other EU countries. So we don't even get any kind of that benefit. And the other successful thing that has happened is that part of rehabilitating those profits is rebuilding profits of finance capital. And that was done by convincing the Irish people to load €8,500 of bank debt per capita on their backs. That's just the direct bank debt, not the contingent, as compared to other countries. Not only were we highly successful in doing that, the government was highly successful in doing that without creating a revolution in the streets, which I would imagine would have occurred if any other country tried to pull that one off. So in that sense, it's been successful. And finally, all this in the context that we are a low-waged economy, relatively low-waged. These just look at the countries that are not in bailout. Obviously, we're higher waged than Greece and Portugal, but compared to other Northern European countries, we are a relatively low-waged economy. Just briefly, So in other words, that's my thesis. My thesis is that the Troika entry was pretty seamless in policy terms, just as our exit is going to be pretty seamless in policy terms. Because what do we have to look forward to? The government has told us. There will be continuing austerity up to 2020, except this time it'll be through real austerity, that is in terms of inflation, that they will keep public spending below the rate of inflation. Secondly, they will continue to rework labor market mechanisms. They've already restructured joint labor committees, which were the collective bargaining units for the low-paid sectors, and now they're on the verge of resurrecting an almost unknown statutory piece of law that was introduced in the 1940s, and to resurrect that to, in other words, enable company unionism to come on board. They are calling for the continuing depression of wages and offering tax cuts in return. But as always, they want a continuation of the tax haven type policies which dominate the political and fiscal agenda. Finally, I just say we do have, the working class has a battle, the popular classes have a battle, but the first battle is really with our own domestic elite and our own capitalist class, in association with all other workers and popular classes throughout Europe. Thank you.